Hey, good evening and welcome to our living room. This is the Mathews family. We're gathered. I'm going to have Faith turn the camera so you can see that the other two are here. But this week we have been focusing on the last days of Christ and the events leading up to that. And we wanted to just pre-record a story that I wanted to read for our group. And by the way, we do not do this every night. We try to do this every once in a while, as often as we can get together, look at some scripture, some stories. But particularly I wanted to read this one, and this is something that you'll view on Wednesday, and it's a story of Jesus being anointed in the village of Bethany. And again, I've read a couple of these already this week, but it's from Behold the King of Glory by Russ Ramsey. And so it reads, though Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday were filled with harrowing experiences that seemed to be drawing him ever nearer to his death, on Wednesday Jesus was still. He and his disciples had gone to the home of a man in Bethany known as Simon the leper. Simon belonged to a growing part of the population known not for their accomplishments, but for what was wrong with them. It was a difficult life, but also strangely liberating, since the first thing people learned about Simon was his broken past. Simon lived among the few who did not have to pretend to be what they were not. He was Simon the leper. People could choose his company or reject it, but that was who he was. His history with leprosy made Simon's home a relatively safe place for the ostracized and destitute of his community. Simon invited Jesus and his disciples to his home for a feast. Bethany was festive as pilgrims arrived by the score to stay with old friends and relatives in preparation for the Passover. It was both the command of God and the joy of Israel to celebrate how God had delivered them from their slavery in Egypt into this land flowing with milk and honey. The extravagances of a feast were a statement to the senses that they no longer lived in desolation but in abundance. The feast at Simon the leper's home was no exception. They ate, drank, and laughed to their heart's content. And after the meal, Simon and his guests settled in for some conversation. The levity was good for the disciples' hearts. Through Jesus' more recent actions and words, he led his followers into a deepening understanding of what he meant when he spoke of his coming arrest and execution. At first, his statements on the matter were veiled, either by design or by the disciples' own dullness of mind and heart. But in light of his most recent clashes with the temple authorities, Jesus' words had taken on flesh and come alive for them. Though the feast was festive, there lurked a sober foreboding in the backs of the disciples' minds, as though they were nearing the end of something and uncertain of what that end would bring. While they reclined around Simon's table, Mary, Lazarus' sister, came into the room carrying a stone-hewn bottle. She handled the flask as though it were a rare and precious jewel. Knowing what it was, her brother leaned forward in his seat. His sister had been saving this bottle for a long time. Many times she had told Lazarus and Martha what she meant to do with it. The sealed stone bottle was made of Egyptian alabaster. It held a pound of exotic Arabian perfume called nard. The costly scent fetched close to a day's wage for a day's supply, and so it belonged mostly to the wealthy and powerful. Arabian nard was the scent of opulence, the fragrance of those whose needs had been met and wanted for nothing. Over the years, Mary's family had saved a half-liter of the exotic fragrance equal to a full year's wage. And now Mary was its keeper. Mary took a seat on the floor beside Jesus, turning the bottle in her hands as the men talked. Gripping the bottle with both hands, she broke the stone neck, and the scent of kings wafted up, filling the room with a fragrance that brought an instinctively reverent silence. And then, with every eye now on her, she began to pour the oil-based perfume on Jesus' head, so that it saturated his scalp, filled into the sides of his beard, and whipped through his garment onto his shoulders and back. After this, she used what remained to anoint his feet. This was an intimate moment between friends. Jesus had given Mary so much, not only by saving her brother, but also by being her friend. Though her sister Martha expressed her love through cooking and serving, Mary was a woman of extravagance when it came to giving the gift of unhurried time. The perfume gave her time with Jesus, and she wanted to spend it all. Many regarded the perfume Mary poured out over Jesus' head and feet as her only security for the future. They immediately began to question her judgment. But this was no whim. It was Mary's response to what Jesus had given her. He had brought her brother back from the dead and then promised to do the same with her. In this promise, she sensed that Jesus meant to give her something more and wouldn't stop until he was finished. So in return, she gave Jesus everything she had. She anointed her king's head with oil in the presence of his enemies and made lovely the feet of the one who had brought her so much good news. The disciples reacted as men often do. They thought about the value of her perfume. It seemed a waste. They thought about how they might have capitalized on the nard's value if it were theirs. And to voice such dreams seems vulgar, but something needed to be said, and so they dressed their indignation in the noble auspices of concern for the poor. They said to each other, think of the poor people who could have benefited from the sale of this perfume. Well, hearing this, Jesus came to Mary's aid and said, leave her alone. What she's done is beautiful. You will always have the poor, but you won't always have me. The men in the room regarded that alabaster bottle as a commodity. Mary should have held on to it in the event that she needed to trade it in. But what were such fragrances for? Perfume was meant to be spilled out and evaporated in order that it might fill a room with its beautiful and startling aroma. As the scent electrified the senses of everyone present, Jesus called it beautiful. Creation testified to a maker who delighted in beauty for beauty's sake. So many things in their world were beautiful that didn't need to be because God opted to make them that way. This could only be for two reasons: because beauty pleased him, and so that it might arrest his people by their senses to wake them from their slumbering economy of pragmatism. Jesus said to Mary's critics, she has given me this gift because she is preparing me for my burial, and history will never forget her act of beauty. Wherever stories are told of me, people will remember her. Well, for 3 years, Judas Iscariot kept, and he stole from, the purse that supported Jesus and the disciples as they traveled. He made his way through life by determining what a thing was worth and functioning within that economy. At first, Jesus seemed to carry the power of a warlike king, but lately, Judas's days with Jesus brought more suffering than notoriety. Mary's lavish act and Jesus' response were more than he could bear. As that perfume dripped from Jesus' beard, Judas saw his life as with those drops in the very act of being wasted. Judas appeared to be invested in Jesus' ministry. He had even gone out and proclaimed the kingdom of God when Jesus sent out the 12. He had seen miracles, signs, and wonders, but Judas was ready to do the unthinkable without a second thought. Though he spent years with Jesus, he never loved him. He was so close to Jesus, yet he was still lost. But all the time, no one but Jesus knew the true heart of Judas, or any of the 12 for that matter, because a man's thoughts are often hidden. After dinner, Judas slipped away from Simon the leper's house. He crossed the Kidron Valley, this time on his own. He was going to have a very different meeting with the chief priests than ones Jesus had been having. How much will you give me if I hand him over to you? Judas said. It chilled him to discover they had an answer. 30 pieces of silver, about 4 months' wages. Jesus' life and Judas' betrayal added up to 1/3 of the value of Mary's perfume. Just enough to make it through the winter. And Judas agreed. He hoped he could salvage the time wasted following this man who proved to be something other than what Judas had thought. But even before he took one step back toward Bethany, his plans, like venom, had already begun to liquefy his soul. Jesus put everything now in the context of his pending death. The scent that covered Jesus' body, filling the room, would remain on him for the next several days before the scented oils dissipated and were spent. He knew well what those days would bring. Mary's perfume would stay with him through everything Judas had set in motion: his arrest, trial, death, and burial. Judas's and the chief priest's plan would not be able to escape Mary's gift. Every lash of a whip would release the scent of nobility into the air. With every blow to his face, every rub of the crossbeam, every tearing away of the garment from a wound, the scent of opulence would fill the air and linger wherever he went. And though a king had passed through this violent world, or as though a king had passed through this violent world and left behind his spirit. And as I think about the story, I think the question that I have to ask, we all have to ask, is how much is Jesus worth to us? You know, she wanted to show her worship by giving her life savings, a full year's worth of wages, everything a person would make in a year. And she spent it that night on Jesus. And I just think that's an important question that we all have to ask. So I encourage you to take some time thinking through that and praying through that as you watch this video. Thanks for tuning in to the Mathews Manor. We're going to sign off. Everybody say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Lathy is over there hiding.